sub-region, upcoming elections in the sub-region. And today we have a most intriguing subject. I'd like to thank Professor Wole Soyinka for honoring us to address the council today. I was telling him 2 nights ago that the most intriguing part of his subject to me was the bit about ABURI optimism, and I can't wait to hear his views on that subject. The idea about these lectures, the hope of the council is to try and bring matters of international issues to the public, because I'm not certain that in our country the discourse on foreign policy or international issues has sufficiently engaged the public. And so one of the main ambitions of CFR-GHANA is to try and expand the participants in the whole foreign policy formulation process. And we hope that this will continue, because our next speaker will be the Deputy Secretary General of the UN. And I'll be announcing this in the middle of October. This will be around the end of October. Mr. Chairman, without much ado, I'd like to thank you for joining us today wherever you are, and I hope that we have a wonderful time, and to thank Professor Wole Soyinka once again. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, CFR President D.K. Osei. And now may I invite Mr. Abraham Agbozo, who is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, to introduce the distinguished speaker for today. He'll be speaking on the subject, on the topic, Afro-Pessimism against Horizons of ABURI Optimism.
Thank you, Kweku. Mr. Chairman, the Swedish Nobel Academy described him as one of the finest poetical playwrights that have written in English. And he's famously remembered as the first African to win the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1986. Our distinguished guest speaker for today is indeed in exalted company, not only as the foremost playwright and poet of his generation, but also because of his familiarity with prison on account of his activism and his criticism of African despots. These criticisms of African strongmen are reflected in such works as Kongi's Harvest and A Play of Giants. He moves further into rarefied territory, into what I call the club of prison writers: Nelson Mandela, Ezra Pound, Oscar Wilde. Because even as he remained shackled like the aforementioned, he continued writing. In 1967, during a term in prison, he, and I quote, wrote surreptitiously on cigarette packets, toilet paper, and between the lines of books he secretly managed to acquire, end of quote. Many of those scribblings were later compiled into his 1972 book, The Man Died, Prison Notes of Wole Soyinka. He did not only write The Man Died, he came to our very own University of Ghana to teach and research. It was from here he went to Cambridge University, where his major play, Death and the King's Horseman, was written. My first encounter with our distinguished guest speaker was through 2 memorable characters of his, Lakunle the village teacher and Baruka the lion of Ilujinle. Both were characters in his 1962 play, The Lion and the Jewel. In the play, he developed and explored, among others, the themes of gender roles and tradition versus progress. However, as an impressionable young man, reading The Lion and the Jewel as required text for my O-levels almost 30 years after it was published, I was taken in by other more important themes in the book. I learned how in the wooing stakes, cunning and wisdom trumps wordiness. I learned that flattery has won over truth any day, both in politics and especially in romance. Finally, as Sidi the village belle found out, I learned that a lion is not important until he's certifiably dead. Let's hear Baruka the lion. Quote, "To think that I once thought, Sidi is the eye's delight, but she's vain, and her head is feather light and always giddy with a trivial thought. And now I find her deep and wise beyond her years." End of quote. Baruka is master of the art of damning with faint praise, and ultimately he bested Lakunle. A less known aspect of our guest speaker is his forays into music. He was a cafe singer in Paris in his mid-20s. 2 decades later, and back in Nigeria, he would write a 2-track album named Unlimited Liability Company. And you guessed right, his voice featured on both tracks. Ladies and gentlemen, I can barely contain my thrill as I ask you to join me to welcome our distinguished guest lecturer for today, Professor Akinwande Oluwole Babatunde Soyinka.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman of the Foreign Council, members of the Council, my dear friends and countrymen and women, because as you know, I have a very personal relationship with Ghana. This has been a very long journey. I've undertaken many journeys in my life, but this has been one of the weirdest. I know the US is a very long way away, but it takes 6 months to get here. That is something of a record. I virtually had to beg the pilot to please divert just next door, virtually, to Nigeria, since Ghana closed her borders just before Nigeria did her own lockdown. But I knew they couldn't keep me out of Nigeria, but I didn't attempt to try and breach the borders of Ghana because they seem to be very, very serious with this new thing, and even as usual, stole a march on Nigeria. And that's where I intend to begin, this strange rivalry between Nigeria and Ghana. It's a kind of love-hate relationship, which I've never fully understood. But so we'll begin, really, not merely with current issues, but bothersome and uncomfortable issues. We must not leave room for accusation of shying away from serious, rather ticklish issues, actualities, while we're roaming the world and indulging in abstractions and so on, and time and history. And so I must begin by apologizing on behalf of my countrymen and women for decades of the severe mangling of the name that features in the title of this address. One that triggers off the address triggers off a confused medley of emotions and an analysis in my compatriots, being a name that very nearly altered the course of that nation, mine, over half a century ago. I refer to that mountainous area known to Ghanaians as ABURI, but which Nigerians, the speaker included until recently, have somehow been miseducated into pronouncing ABURI. How could it have been otherwise when after what was a make or break conference for the continuing existence of any immediate post-independence nation, one of the parties returned home with the ringing cry of "On ABURI we stand"? That, of course, drew a counter-response, "Keep Nigeria one." And to think that all that time we were mangling the name of the venue so generously allocated by our neighborly interventionists. there's a lesson to be drawn from that, but I hesitate to extract the fullness of that lesson. I mean, really, the least a guest, however brief a guest, can do is to be able to pronounce the name of his or her host correctly. To say, thank you, Mr. So-and-so, and make sure it's the right pronunciation. Sometimes, of course, big issues are traceable to small beginnings, trivial beginnings. Could this mangling of the name ABURI have contributed in however minuscule a dimension for the current hostilities between the two nations? I'm aware, however, that the Speaker of the Nigerian Lower House of Representatives recently visited in his official capacity, met with his counterpart here, and held serious discussions. I can only wish them oodles of luck on both sides. I'm sure both of them are aware that the current disagreement goes back quite a long way. For our young participants, however, or those who are somewhat history challenged, you know, in some countries, history is actually expunged from the school curriculum. That was the situation, Shemoa, until a year or two ago. For many years, for some reason or other, history was actually not taught in schools. What the situation is here, I have no idea. But I think for the sake of those who might be equally history challenged, just a few comic to tragi-comic brickbats between the two countries, just to situate ourselves properly. One of our commencing prime ministers, for instance, just pre-independence, referred to Ghana, which was, you know, sort of preening itself as a progressive ideological bastion, referred to Ghana as a mere ant in relation to the gigantic Nigeria. That was Tafawa Balewa's government, and the premier, to make matters worse, was then known as the man with the golden voice. Now, such accolade certainly did not help matters. I mean, golden voice. Gold belonged to Ghana. The name of Ghana before was Gold Coast. And here were these two rivals, and then the premier of one is being touted as the man with the golden voice after having called the neighbor an ant in relation to the nation. So perhaps that's where it all began. If we go back a little in history, maybe we can solve all these ticklish issues. Now, maybe our theory is a little bit far-fetched because not very long after, the president of this nation, that is after Nkrumah, Dr. Busia, then told Nigerians in this country to please pack their bags and go home. It was bad enough that the gold of Ghana was being now attributed to Nigeria, and then Nigeria insulting Ghana, and he said, please just go back and leave our gold behind. The matter didn't end there. This was before. Busia was a historian, of course, and maybe he was a visionary, because it wasn't gold, I mean oil, that liquid gold hadn't really been found in Nigeria yet. But I think he anticipated that this insult would come, so he told them to go home. Then long after, gold was found. Forgive my, I'm not very much bothered, is events, so the sequence is slightly skewed. Not that I'm taking poetic license. So, but not long after, when the liquid oil was found in Nigeria, Ghanaians then put about a story that having attempted to appropriate their gold, we were actually, the oil in Nigeria was actually belonged to Ghana, and that we had dug an underground tunnel from Ghana. And this is what was being piped out in Nigeria, being called Nigerian oil. So that we should go and sit down, and all we did was steal everything from Ghana. So these brickbats continued for quite a while, despite Ghana then forgiving, rising above the past, and offering a venue to solve a critical problem in Nigeria, which was a make or break event. And we end up calling ABURI, ABURI. So one can understand how things got to such a state that at once the expression Ghana must go then became prevalent in Nigeria, and this is when our Prime Minister gave, I think, maybe 48 hours notice, I'm no longer sure, for Ghanaians to please go back home to their gold and the oil which they said they had over there. And this is quite a serious exodus. I was there at the time, and I know that I even was accused of being a traitor to Nigeria, because I was teaching at the University of Ife, and I said, well, we don't recognize this kind of expulsion, and that any Ghanaians who felt unsafe should come inside the campus and will be protected, while in my department, those who felt that they wanted to go will be provided with transportation. And I remember even putting our bus in the Department of Theatre Arts, University of Ife, to take some of them back. For which I received quite some brickbats, and I was told to go back to my home in Ghana. I hadn't even established any connection with Ghana at that particular time. Later, of course, that's a very different personal story. Now, why do I take the problem of narrating to this audience a little bit of that story, especially that aspect, which I assure you was not intended to put some of us in a good light. You know, there's a reason for it. It's simple. I've always held that states and nations can act stupidly, but that humanity must rise above the stupidities of government. I have a very simple credo that humanity transcends state or nation. Before nations, humanity was, and I believe that after nations and states, humanity will continue to be. Now, I'm not as historically naive as that claim may sound. It's undeniable, I agree, that nation is an entrenched fact of global actualities and cannot be wished away. I merely insist that nations are artificial constructs unanchored in any immutable way when placed side by side with that organic phenomenon known as humanity. And even wherever the interests of state are cited, the humanity enclosed within it is the sole reason and justification for the existence of the state. Now, humanity has a voice and a faculty of volition that it can and should morally exercise wherever a choice has to be made. That attribute remains valid and may be manifested in complementarity with or in opposition to the policies of any government. If we reject such a proposition, then we lose all entitlement to moral outrage or expressions of solidarity with movements that we consider movements of righteous dissent anywhere in the world, such as, for instance, the movement now known as I Cannot Breathe, or Black Lives Matter, and allied protests anywhere in the world, including our own struggles here against colonialism, both internal and external. The economic well-being of any people, of course, imposes on us an immediate field of collective introspection in this respect. So, because here we are now, gathered together in a nation that recently chose to place a licensing fee of $1 million US on any externally owned venture, even from neighboring nations, including members of the same economic zone known as ECOWAS. An immediate question is this a reasonable levy? For those of us who do periodically patronize what is known as the informal sector of any nation's economy, this is where we do our shopping, it's cheaper there. That is, the small shops, for instance, wherever we find ourselves, that's where we first go, as opposed to, let us say, the heavy enterprises, heavily endowed enterprises, housing glass, wraparound, high-rise buildings and other centers. We're talking, for instance, small shops, second-hand clothing shops for some, market stalls, spare part dealers, small electronic repair villages, etc., etc. These are the ones whose businesses are closed down for defaulting on such an astronomical levy. That, let me quickly add, is the picture which we receive, for instance, on the streets. Is the picture, is the reality which levitated, for instance, the Speaker of the lower house in Nigeria to come over to Ghana to speak to his counterpart. These are elected people close to their constituencies to see whether something could be done about this remarkable kind of imposition. However, it is again equally charged that Nigeria commenced this latest round of economic hostilities against the same sector of Ghanaian economy, albeit indirectly, but even more devastating, with more devastating consequences for that economic sector through a closure of borders that has now moved into a second year. So there we go again. The wearisome seesaw, tic-tac games, whose constant, however, is the humanity as victim. Ministers talk to ministers, speakers to speakers, parliaments to parliaments. But when it comes to the hordes of humanity, because we're not talking here of the Wole Soyinkas or the Anthony Appiahs, etc., etc. No, we're talking about the large scale, but small, the large quantitatively, but small scale humanity, which actually we find form the backbone of a nation's economy, at least on this planet that we call the African continent. Well, ultimately, I suppose after talking, both sides will discover they've been talking at cross purposes, and one has been talking ABURI, the other ABURI. And eventually, perhaps, the linguistic gap will be closed and will extend to the economic. Now, where and how did I most recently receive my own correction in this respect? My education goes on all the time, of course, but this one was very remarkable and historic in a number of implications. I was looking for a retreat. You know, that spasm that seizes writers and allied temperaments periodically from time to time. And if that writer is a Nigerian, I assure you that sort of feeling of need is especially intensive and even more frequent. I don't know how it is in Ghana these days. I've been here for quite a while. So my immediate preceding hideout was in a little village, Yene, off Dakar. It's provided for me by a young colleague from NYU. And after about 8 days, my work plan was not yet fully assuaged. I still needed an extension of that sanctuary. And my young colleague there, Ivor, managed to propose to me the possibility, oh, okay, I'll make sure I don't knock it out. the possibility of a hideout in Accra. It took a while for me to understand what he was saying. Because he said, but you know it, Nigeria knows the place. I said, no, I never heard about ABURI in all my life. But if you say it's a quiet, nice place, that's okay, I'll come there. He said, but it's impossible. All Nigerians know ABURI. Eventually, I knew what he was talking about. And it was a baronial sanctuary owned by the former president, President Kufuor, which he very generously lent to me for the completion of my self-assigned work. And when I saw it, the moment I got there, I said, on ABURI I stand. And unlike, however, the original ABURI purposed usage, I am able to say that I did produce something positive there. However, this is the interesting side observation. Throughout the time I was there, I could see the hall, the conference hall where this historic event took place, and I never went there. I was curious. I had it on my agenda that after doing some work, I'll just go there and see what had happened. But I couldn't bring myself eventually to go there. Now, why was that? There were two reasons, one minor. Maybe this was carrying my detachment, my need for detachment too far, but there it was. I felt that if I went into that building, that I might come out feeling so depressed that I would end up just moping and doing nothing of the work that took me to that hideout. The second, however, was even more critical. It was fear. I felt that if I went into that building, having just left Nigeria, and with my imaginative temperament, reconstructing what went in there, the battle, the argument, the negotiations, all of which ended in zero, I would come out saying to my hosts, you better prepare for a second round. By the time I left Nigeria during that time, I was beginning to feel that we might be on the verge of a historic repeat. That I might have to ask Ghanaians, please start refurbishing this place because we're coming back. Even the cause that took Nigeria there in the first place, which was the Biafran movement towards secession, had resurfaced under different names. MASOB, IPOD, not only in terms of agitation, but already involving casualties. Just 2 weeks ago, in fact, the security people went there where supposed Biafrans were regrouping, supposedly, ended up with a number of innocent people being killed, including a couple of security officers. Turned out that yes, indeed, they were Biafran agitators, but they were just meeting peacefully. The usual inquiry, one expects, is going on. We'll find out exactly what happened. But there it is. There's the ABURI issue not yet resolved. What was even more disquieting for me personally was the fact that this imperative of autonomy, dressed in different ways on many levels, had even spread to my own people, the Yoruba. And by the time I left, in fact, there were already calls for the Autonomous Republic of Oduduwa, not only on the airwaves and social media, but even with demonstrations in the streets. And so we come to the question, what is wrong? What goes on here? What is it that is missing, or what we're taking for granted in terms of human association, expectations, and even ideologies? Now, this problem, let me insist, does not pertain to any one nation. And so when I speak, for instance, ABURI, I do not refer solely to its association with a more familiar trouble space called Nigeria in this particular instance. And we're not even speaking of the extremism of the secessionist option in nation becoming, but of internal cohesion, stability, viability as a functioning entity. Secession and cohesion are not necessarily alternatives, and neither guarantees nor precludes the other. Today's imperative for any exercise in the cause of guaranteed cohesion within nations spreads, of course, across every sub-region and indeed across the entire continent. Afro-pessimism sometimes strikes one as being grounded in the very swaddling clothes of the continent's parturition, becoming accentuated with the very evolution of national identities that logically accompanied independence. And so, I'm afraid we need to expand that conference hall in 2020 over and beyond the expectations of the needs of 1965. Now that is Afro-pessimism for you. Unfortunately, this is the abiding picture that we, if we're truthful to ourselves, we encounter when we look all over the continent. Now, the picture is not entirely negative, that I must insist upon. I admit that this, the immediate geographical sector, the West African sub-region, has proved that it can act together, the leadership from time to time, to bring the semblance of order and justice in particular, to bear in resolving isolated cases of internal ruptures. Also, some credit should go to the overall platform itself, the African Union, in some conflict zones, such as, for instance, the much troubled space called Sudan. The successes remain limited, however, and inconstant, and the price that this continent seems to pay for those resolutions seem to me excessive, even staggering. After all, it's now over 60 years since the last nation became independent. From time to time, I think we must look introspectively and ask ourselves, isn't this an age of maturation, even for nations? Still, one cannot but applaud the efforts by African states, for instance, to quote a very recent one, to expel that repellent dictator, Yahya Jammeh, from his illicit attachment to perpetual power. I still recall my denunciation, several, but the one which I wish to point out was the one which took place right here at Power House during a conference, when I sent a personal message to Mr. Jammeh, who at the time was threatening to cut off heads of homosexuals, and said he had discovered the cure for AIDS, and he was administering hallucinogens to the opposition to prove whether they were witches or not. If they died from the toxic, then they were witches. If they survived, then, or is it vice versa, kind of this medieval trial by ordeal. If they survived, then they were witches. If they died, then it was just too bad. And today, I didn't know at the time, in fact, that I was sitting not far from a Gambian representative, a lady. She took it very well. Her body language, in fact, indicated that if she was able, she would have said a lot more, stronger than what I said at the time. This is what I encounter all the time. But today, just in case you have all forgotten or that is not on your radar, we have in Uganda another situation in which a similar message is appropriate. We ask ourselves, what is the problem? What is this attachment to power over and beyond even capability? Not even to talk of entitlement, which of course is a very loaded word. Why are our leaders, even at the expense of internal cohesion, so stuck on power? From time to time, as I keep saying, there are the positive areas, zones, but then we become complacent and we get very cruelly punished for our over-optimism. And we ask, isn't it much safer to be thoroughgoing pessimists so that we are not unpleasantly surprised? My invocation of this particular instance, Museveni's Uganda, is not accidental, and it's not, I emphasize, raised in isolation. Yesterday, it was Yahya. Before that, it was Mugabe. Today, and quite recently, in fact, it was my next-door neighbor, the Republic of Benin, where the opposition had to use what we call the Nadeco route. That is not the regular entry point to Nigeria, to seek support. Because huge areas of that little country, next door neighbor Benin, were being disenfranchised simply to ensure a continuity in power by the incumbent. Now, that of course is a claim, the position paper, put to us by these colleagues of ours who came across, both politicians, non-politicians, intellectuals, even workers, who came to seek help for the forthcoming election, ensure that we're put back on the ballot box. Of course, they were making a mistake by appealing to us, because what was our last election like? One of the bloodiest that we'd had for a very long time, after the so-called election of the century that took place in I've forgotten the date. Anyway, this was supposed to be considered the one which brought into power Moshood Abiola, who later, of course, died mysteriously in prison. That was supposed to have been the freest election. However, by contrast, this particular election before that brought in the incumbent, I deliberately do not mention names because they always say there's something personal between me and this. So I'll just refer you to the new election. You find out who was in power at the time. But it was a mistake to have even attempted to seek help from Nigeria at that particular time. In Togo, the last election is still being disputed. And in any case, what aspect of progress is it that goes back to a feudal dynastic thinking? That there has to be a succession on the line of coup makers to bring the continent into self-realization and advancement. Something, kind of gene, the genetic property, which demands that elections be rigged to ensure that a particular line of humanity continues to control the affairs of a nation. What is this curious attachment? So we're not talking just about secession, we're talking also about internal cohesion. But under circumstances in which the populace is not permitted to feel that they have a stake in their own governance, that they, in effect, own the government, own, that is, as in participation, the right to statement of accountability, and of course, fundamental human rights. Then, when there's a genuine crisis, including nature-produced floods, etc., maybe even invasion from the outside, maybe just COVID, there's a kind of apathy which is generated, in which the populace says, well, it's your government, solve it. even to their own detriment. I invoke this, the emotive expression, mantra, Black Lives Matter, deliberately, to pose the question, do Black Lives Matter only in the United States? Because we now come to perhaps the question for the African continent to solve. It's not merely secular power that has proved deleterious to the progress, the self-realization of the African continent, but the theocratic. Contest it who you can when you look at the situation in Nigeria today, and increasingly across the West African Suite, you find that the greatest problematic right now is that of religious imperialism. And this is why we have a right and a responsibility to call on governments to kindly face the real crisis that confronts the African continent, rather than finding dissidents under the bed, under the chair, and exerting the entire resources of nations to deal with individuals like, for instance, Kangilai Bob Wine, who is one of the contestants for presidency in that country, in Uganda, who's persecuted up and down. This is an elected member of parliament, a musician, yes, but who has created such a following, owing largely to the disillusionment with existing governments. Across the border, however, constantly mounting violent and disastrous incursion into national borders are the new myrmidons of disruption with theocratic forces. We simply have to stop frittering away not just the material resources, but the human resources of our societies, and neglecting what actually is featuring as the most nation-destructive, destabilizing force that this continent has ever known. It's unthinking to imagine that these problems will be solved specifically within the environment, the geographical borders in which they erupt. We reached a point where we must learn even to abandon, not totally, but at least to reduce the rhetoric of national sovereignty. We don't want interference in our affairs. We had interference from the very beginning. There's an ongoing interference from borderless forces, which, however, have the capacity and have proven and continue to prove the capacity to unleash even the might of registered, recognized nations against the complacent nations, not just in West Africa, but East Africa and Central Africa. These are represented today by what I call the religious imperialism. Now, we're accustomed, of course, to all forms of association, formal or informal, ECOWAS, etc., etc. Some, in fact, which are purely historic and sentimental in attachment, Lusophone, Anglophone, Francophone, etc., Commonwealth, French overseas, etc., etc. But there are today, new forms of association, indeed interlocking, sophisticated global networks which amount to quasi-nations. Does one appear to state the obvious? If so, perhaps it is because there are some such coalitions that are not yet regarded as such. And so perhaps it is time to call attention to this, which is the most prevalent and strident example of such trans-border formulations the negative face of the collaborative impulse, one that contemptuously sweeps aside the functional givens of individual national consciousness and with ruthless, devastating impact on the populace of this continent. It's no longer possible today, I propose, to underestimate, to pretend ignorance of the new borderless formulations of the religious irredentist nature, resolutely committed in a new round of subjugation of African humanity. And that, from any point of view you choose, is the immediate and future enemy of the African continent. A product of messianic vampirism that now fastens on the continent's jugular is sworn to impose a way of life that is totally alien to and contemptuous of the modes of existence that define what we are and the direction in which we choose, whether individually or collectively, to propel our future development as equal members of a global community. It is nothing more mystifying than that. We appear to have entered an era of visionary distortions. By that I mean, quite plainly, that these movements are a parody, yes, but a deadly one, of early visionary pronouncements that either preceded or accompanied our piecemeal independences. African unity, Pan-Africanism, African personality, Black consciousness, African Renaissance, etc., all those charged expressions are sought to make us, in our youth, feel part of the formation of a new liberated order of being after centuries of racial stigma and disdain. We are confronted with these crude coalitions that wish to banish history and, if possible, abolish memory. If, for instance, Boko Haram had not made the mistake of banning books altogether, its sanctimonious emissaries and thought vigilantes would simply have embarked on a wholesale revisionist policy on the contents of even the books that we use to teach our children. Students of African liberation, for instance, movements, would have their books confiscated, and when those books are returned, you'll find that wherever the history of Black consciousness movement is recorded, the slogan, "Black is beautiful," has been inked out. In its place, we'll find "God is beautiful." But perhaps you think I exaggerate. Now, no one takes time off to contest any proposition of God's beauty. Only idlers enter into verbal or other forms of warfare over something that is beyond their knowledge. The new breed of visionaries, however, go further in their annunciation of the divine beauty contest, whose aesthetics must be defended as the foundation of a new ideology of morbidity. They kill, they behead, they amputate, they stone to death, but they also claim space as of right. Cynically, they enthrone contradictions, eyes, mind, and soul allegedly tuned to the afterlife. They nonetheless insist on a violent claim to the possession and control of landed property. And the problem with the very mention of ABURI is this: can such minds be invited to dialogue across the table? Can one hold even a mundane conversation with such minds? Are they possible candidates for the optimism of ABURI? Or are they compulsively self-impaled on the binary cross of domination and submission. These are the latest and not the most implacable human agents of Afro-pessimism. They have become the question of our time. When the psychopathic movement known today as Boko Haram, recently joined by ISWAP, the Islamic something states, West Africa, etc., the instinctive feeling among the leadership and general populace was, one, that it was confined to a specific section of the nation; two, that it was the product of a power play in one section, that section, the Northeast region, political power play; and three, that it would peter out at no time. I shall not bother here with the obvious fourth, which no one seriously contends, one which, however, often provides an alibi for ideologues whose textbooks did not quite anticipate such a virulent eruption. That variant being that this was a product of class warfare and the inequitable distribution of wealth and resources, etc., etc. We shall concede all of that and more, in varying proportions of attribution, of course, and effect. There are those who are comfortable with replacing complex issues with partial. What we should not pretend ignorance of, however, is simply this: a war has been declared on an unprepared populace, a war that moved to ply the roads, invade and take over farms and silos, breaking the food chain that animates the markets. Suddenly, these quite unpretentious but efficient links in the chain of human productivity found themselves casual, arbitrary targets, victims of faceless intruders on their organic orders of existence. And what was the response? As casualties mounted from one general, let's begin with him, an army general, on this unequal warfare. He said at the beginning of this religion-inspired malady, said, "Ah, well, never mind. The insurgency will soon peter out. The killers will soon run out of suicide belts." Yes, that was the beginning, at the beginning. That was the optimistic, quote-unquote, outlook. You know, we sometimes hear that politics is too serious an occupation to be left to politicians. Well, I like to vary that and say that warfare is too serious an undertaking to be left in the hands of the military. But then on the civilian side, the national leader at the time announced that he had better things to do than to commence a search for ghosts. Actually, it was a rather arresting turn of phrase. I was quite impressed. If anything, it had a touch of originality to it, which I hadn't expected from that rather challenged head of state. So let's just also say, arguably, that what he was saying, that maybe he was even misunderstood, that what he was saying was that, and he did elaborate at some other occasion, that the people there themselves knew who the enemy was. They knew who were the individual enemies, and that they shouldn't waste his time going to chase what they already knew. After that, of course, came Chibok, which today has now been totally resolved. Well, I need to remind you that the insurgents have not exactly run out of suicide bombs, belts, I beg your pardon. If they're not using them, it's because they even have more lethal, sophisticated weaponry, even directed at the military. But there was no shortage, eventually, of an attempt to address the issue on a holistic basis. Only it was too late and much too little. Dialogue was also proposed. There were three heads of state who actually pronounced themselves ready to dialogue. One was a civilian, And what was the response? The insurgents said, oh, you want a dialogue? First of all, you must convert. We only talk to fellow Muslims. So you want to talk to us? Convert. Another one, who, however, was a Muslim, a military leader, he was told by the insurgents, oh, you are worse than an infidel because you're a Muslim, and you're a blasphemer, you're a hypocrite. And so, we'll kill you. But don't worry, you will die. You can go to paradise because you're a Muslim, but we'll kill you anyway. As a third, a former general who even took the step to visit the original, the initiator, Yusuf Mohammed, after he was extrajudicially killed, went and visited the family and said, let's talk. Forgive and forget. We know you have been wronged. Now, nobody, to my knowledge, except maybe those who did the murder, nobody supports extrajudicial killing. First of all, it's always a cover-up. These insurgents do not act alone. They have sponsors. They have participants. Some of them in the civil service. Some of them even in security services. And so when you hear that there's been extrajudicial killing, you know, it's a cover-up. It's deliberate. It's not accidental. However, one thing was forgotten by this particular head of state, who should be nameless, that Mr. Yusuf Mohammed and Boko Haram were no angels, and they were arranged not only against non-believers, but even against their own people. They had already committed murder against their own people. They had already razed police stations. They had slaughtered believers, giving options to their victims, convert or be killed. Some of them actually chose to be killed. And we had a situation where even on account of this kind of appeasement policy, our brothers and sisters in the diaspora were taking the side of the insurgents. Example, there was a group of intellectuals, some of whom I even knew personally, I took it up with them, who appealed to their government in the United States to remove the name Boko Haram from the list of declared terrorist organizations. And why? One, yes, because the leader had been extrajudicially killed. But also because, I quote, by placing this organization under the terrorist category, they will be unable to continue their research into this insurgency. Go and read that statement. I do not exaggerate and I do not invent. It's there, took it up. Among the causes why the US government was being invited to remove them from the list of category, or not to place them on, after even our own government had demanded that they be considered and grouped as terrorists, was, among them was, they wouldn't be able to approach them to conduct their PhD thesis. They didn't actually say PhD thesis, but it came to more or less the same thing. And so we have this unusual, and for me abnormal, and very strange, perverse kind of treatment of the assailants of humanity, always under some kind of rationalization. This is not an exercise in recriminations, no. We are under a very real and continuing siege. We are in a situation where even in once ecumenical cities like Kaduna, the average casualty per week runs into 3 digits. There was a recent massacre, 140 something. And yet we're not without a sense of history. We know that while there's something unique about this particular insurgents on the African continent, there's nothing new about it. We know the history of terror. We know the history of religious fundamentalism all over the world, all over the globe. And we know also the consequences of appeasement. We also know the consequences of partial approach, and we know the benefits of a holistic view, not only of antecedent causes, but of the current motivation of insurgent organizations, movements, especially of the religious kind. You can dialogue with a secular ideologue. Where do you begin to dialogue with the theocratic? You're dealing with a mind that is already programmed, completely programmed, and impenetrable, for the simple reason that that fanatic considers you a subhuman. So the problem is not easy. It's not facile, not by any means. And you have this constant apologists, the rationalizers of the irrational, the tolerators of the intolerable, and above all, the guilt-ridden. When you have governments which are so corrupt, which have been guilty themselves of the deprivation of the humanity of their citizens, of course their hands are already tied. There's a basic sense of guilt which cripples the will to rigorous and holistic remedial action. So we come up again and again against the contradictions which have begun not in our time, but which we have inherited and which have become accentuated by neglect and by evasion. We need a kind of conference, a kind of encounter, confrontation that is frank and brutal. I believe that religion has been cosseted far too much, especially religion of a certain kind, a certain tendency has been cosseted far too long and far too deleteriously for the rest of humanity, and especially African humanity. The new ABURI which I conceive of, which for me has become inevitable, should be a concourse of thinkers, builders, and visionaries, not of political calculators and guilty. The real quest for a transformation of the strange cast of mind that thinks nothing of slitting the throats of children for daring to go to school at best, or publicly flogging parents for sending their children to school, amputating the arms of their teachers for daring to teach their wards any subject except the perfection of a God who is, however, created in their own egotistical image. This is the irony. Never mind, of course, that such minds were nurtured through and through indoctrination, through the cynical wiles also of political opportunists, because some of these madrasas, for instance, are operated by political interests, not really of religious interests. And therefore, we need a kind of concourse of African minds which is able to tell religious fundamentalists and fanatics that you're not religious, you're not pious, and you're nothing but crude grabbers for power, land greed, obsessed with domination in the name of religion. If I seem to be setting the agenda, I do not apologize. I believe that the ABURI imperative today, taking place side by side with physical containment, because we cannot stop that immediately or we'll be overrun. You and I know that. Even in Ghana, I think you know that. You've had your cattle rearer problems here. I understand how you dealt with that, by the way. More of that maybe in private talk. So we need a holistic approach which does not deny that the military solution is only partial, but it's not so sentimental as to imagine that it's just a question of re-education alone. No, it goes much deeper, and as I said, it has to be more comprehensive. The original ABURI conference was doomed from the start because of preconceptions. Now, what I'm going to say now, it does not mean that I am promoting fragmentation or secession. I'm merely promoting the habit, the ability to rethink, to be able to go backwards and think what existed before, what was right with it, what was wrong with it, and then to pose that within the framework of a modern society where global interconnection is faster than light in comparison to traditional means. And so when I say, for instance, we need to go beyond the pietism of stasis. What there is belongs. What there is valid, which translates, in our case, to what the white man has put together, let no black mind put asunder. It's all part of this religiosity in which many of us have been brought, these thoughtless pietisms. And this is why ABURI was doomed from the start. Not because it failed to prevent secession, but because the participants went there with a certain mindset that did not recognize the fact that this African continent is just the creation of external forces, and that the creation of nations on the African continent did not have the African interest in mind. It didn't even have the concept of nation in mind, even though nation became a nomenclatural opportunism. But in actual fact, it was zones of supply, zones of production, whose resources then went to the enhancement of the productive patterns and means of imperial societies. And today, we now have a new imperialism, which is preparing all of us for paradise while destroying the quality of existence on this earth. Do I sound as if I am leaning towards an Afro-pessimism? No, I'm merely being realistic. The time is long overdue, I suggest, to organize a total and holistic re-examination of both past and present. We're being dragged backwards, not only into history, but seeming prehistory. Because it is not we on this side of what you consider rationality who willfully exhume this past, but others who not only exhume but insist on a total reinterpretation of what we have set ourselves to be, who dictate what they believe that we should be. And I'm talking both of West and East. Recently, for instance, again, on my home front, we had a situation where the Supreme Sharia Council was calling for the hanging of a man for blasphemy. I'm pretty well immersed in traditional religions, not thoroughly, but pretty well immersed. And I know that it was rare to find any kind of culture in which human beings were being hanged or drowned for something called blasphemy. The pluralism of belief was the bedrock of spirituality on the African continent. Even within the same society, the plurality of the concept of Godhead was one which was based on toleration. And yet, here we have a situation where the Council of Religion says, we know why there's problem in Nigeria. We know where there's killing in Kaduna. It's because you failed to hang some people 20 years ago who were sentenced to death to begin with for participating in a religious riot. The name of one of them is Lekwot. He was one of the high-placed military and civilians who were first sentenced to death in a hastily constructed tribunal by the military. Eventually, it was commuted to 5 years. The condemned served their sentence. All of them are dead now except one, Lekwat. And here we are, 20 years later. We have a supposedly intelligent group of people presiding over the court of a highly respected religion, world religion, Islam, and who take time of piety to call on the government to hang the survivor of that group who's just minding his own business, as an ex-prisoner. However, let me hasten to say that we're dealing with a sector. We're dealing with fanaticism, fundamentalism, which, however, is overriding in the mainstream, the orthodox line of that particular religion. And I think it is time to call such movements to order, especially as it is destabilizing the continent. I quote, the chairman of Transparency International, who also happens to be Muslim, begged to differ from the Sharia court. Dialogue needed, not further bloodshed, TI tells Sharia Council. On its part, the International Anti-Corruption and Human Rights Group, Transparency International, said that what southern Kaduna communities needed was dialogue, reconciliation, and peace building, and not further killings and bloodshed. Chairman TI Nigeria, Musa Rafsanjani, in a chat with Punch, said the position taken by the Sharia Council would not end the violent crisis in the area which had claimed hundreds of lives. He said, I don't think the killing of people spared during the Zango-Kataf crisis is going to bring an end to the violence that we have, because in Islam, there is also forgiveness. In Islam, there is also tolerance and opportunity for a dialogue and peaceful coexistence. The position they have taken is not necessarily going to end the problem. It's important that I cite that so that everyone understands that what we're talking is of a virulent strain, which, however, is international in dimension, is exceedingly powerful in scope, profits from, for instance, the disintegration of countries like Libya, which has let loose a whole horde of mercenaries that can be gobbled up by religious zealots with political agenda. One, in this instance, is clearly the voice of Boko Haram and ISWAP, while the other is what I call the herald of the road to ABURI. Futile to attempt to dialogue, however, as I said before, with the Shekau of the world. But they have their own intellectuals, they have their own sponsors, their own politicians, and it is these who, unfortunately, one is compelled to sit with across the table. At least they occupy more than one side of communication, and it's possible that some element of penetration might ensue. But as long as we lose our intellectual forces, our creative forces, as long as we lose individuals like Kofi Awuno to the forces of irredentism, blind forces of hate, undiscriminating, we have to accept the fact that this continent is at war and stop being complacent in our priorities, in our addressing. So what would I expect from a new ABURI? Well, any proposition, again, we insist that unity, cohesion, physical cohesion does not amount to unity. There's unity of purpose, it's unity of ideology. Forget unity of religion, it's impossible. The world is already too far gone in that. And anyway, who wants a unity of religion when religions are so interesting with the festivals and everything else, if not actually with the spiritualities. So it's not a question of artificial unity, but a unity of purpose, the basis of which it's not merely survival, but existence in full dignity and rights. If from such a congress, a concourse, emerges, and this is why I began with the word unity, emerges even different organizations, such as hopefully a union of secular states. What's wrong with that? A union of secular states in which those who believe in theocracy are allowed to go their own way. Indeed, I believe that theocracy should be expelled from all democratic organizations. Religion belongs either in the heart or in the pocket or on television these days, very lucratively, with these remarkable bad actors, bad theater on the stage. But we must not deny that religion is an essential part of society, but it should be kept away. This continent has the opportunity to place religion where it belongs. And from this new ABURI, definitely I would not be unduly exercised if it results even in a coalition of the willing forming a new secular organization in which African nations can choose to belong or not belong. That way, there will be concerted action against forces of fanaticism, of intolerance, who decimate the intellectual properties, the human actualities, and the productive imperatives of the African continent. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof. Wole Soyinka. Mr. President, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, as you all remember or saw, my position as interim chairman lasted about 3 minutes. I've since then been in the wilderness, since the rear chairman has been in his seat for the last few minutes. It is proper, because I believe in peaceful transition, to now recognize him as the chair and invite him to say a few words. I'm not going to introduce him because in this age of social media, you do the Google and you find everything about him. He's an accomplished banker and is now a chief. But for me personally, and I think for many in the literary world, one major consideration that influenced our choice of him as a chair is because he's a lover of the arts and has been promoting and supporting literary works and activities in this country. At least I've been a beneficiary. So this is a time for us to recognize his role, not just as a banker, as a chief, but as a promoter of the arts. I have the pleasure to invite now Alassane Andani, the chair, the proper chair for the occasion. To say a few words. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and His Excellency Ambassador. And just to say that when I looked into the audience, of course, I knew who was coming to address us, and this has been postponed because of COVID. But finally, we are the better off for having Prof here. And so I was trying to wrap my head around the first conversation I had with His Excellency Ambassador Cabral when he asked me he would want me to chair this function. I love Prof. Wole Soyinka. I've read and listened to him at every occasion. When I looked into this audience, I could only understand why His Excellency Ambassador Cabral and of course this august body would want me to chair, because Prof, whether you listen or read him, reaches very deep into the consciousness of any individual, person, nation, any kind of construct that tries to affect humanity. And to understand Prof, you've got to put the common humanity, especially of the African people, for whom he's extremely passionate. And Prof, for my sins in all of my school days, I read all of the African Writers series, and I can quote voluminously some of your writings. So you've got to put the commonality of the African personality that has driven Prof, from I'm sure his early literary days to now the global status giant that he is. And you listen to him, and I look into this audience, and I see people who probably are quivering in their seats and wondering whether they will find a way to their cars because of what Prof has said. Because the people in this room have been part of the construct of the African nation states. They've been part of the construct that has described, as Prof said, the $1 million for us as common neighbors to trade within what we call artificial borders. We're part of the construct that has looked on as leaders that we have entrusted, whether politically elected, have diverted the attention away from the common humanity that we all aspire to. So I think this was meant for me to allow all of you, very distinguished politicians, diplomats, nation builders, to reflect on your personal role of where we are as an African people, where we are as nation states, where we are in all the constructs. And I think Prof's last around the impact of religion takes one back to Prof. Ali Mazrui African triple heritage, which Prof. Ali Mazrui actually dealt with, which has remained the bane of the African people, the crossroads of religion, colonialism, and our own traditional systems, which we never went back to look at, to see what worked there, what didn't work, and how we could, even in the spirit of learning from everywhere else, make better our traditional systems from what we could learn from colonialism and or religion, but to subjugate everything that we knew as a people to nothingness and tried to construct something totally artificial. So you could almost trace Prof's lecture today back to Prof. Ali Mazrui's the triple African heritage, which has remained a very difficult situation. And I'd say that for those of us here, if we put the African humanity, the common humanity in the circle and look at the challenges that Prof has enumerated today, and his new ABURI, which is probably a union of secular states where tolerance, which was always the base, if those of us in traditional authority, and I've been a follower of traditional, born into it, it is one of those institutions that has thrived on tolerance. accommodated all shades of opinion and still kept the people together. Ask the Ashanti people in Ghana to choose anything else and they would be lost no matter where they have studied. Or ask the Dagomba people to choose any other culture and they'll be lost. And you could say that for literally every other African grouping. So what has kept that? What has kept that together? Our reverence for the Otumfo, our kings, and the irreverence for our leaders and people in public office. Is it because of the confusion? And I think Prof has so brilliantly awakened or severely pricked the conscience of all of you here who are part of the construct of building this country, contributing to the African Renaissance, and challenge you. And probably for those of you who still have the belief, to see what else you can do to help us construct this new ABURI. So Prof, the only reason they asked me to chair is because they have entrenched positions which you have challenged. And I think they'll go back and revise their positions. And this is a seminal paper. It's going to take several years of literary work, Prof, to digest what you've said today. And I would just want to say that our honor to Prof would be to take what for me has been a very deep prick on the conscience of us as leaders, as nation states, as Africans, as religious people, to rethink and to build a better humanity that embraces tolerance, diversity, and the well-being of everyone. So on this note, once again, I want to thank Prof for this. I don't know how to describe it. As I said, I've been a student of yours for years, and it's been extraordinary. So I want to thank you very much, and I want to thank Prof. Cabral for using me to save the blushes of the distinguished personalities in this hall. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chairman Alhaji. Oh, sorry, not Alhaji. Chairman Andani, Al-Hassan Andani, I beg your pardon. And I guess what's left for me to say is just thank you and good night. I've got a couple of thank yous. Thank you to GNPC and Stanbic for, thank you to Petroleum Commission, right? And GNPC, okay. So GNPC, Petroleum Commission, and Stanbic Bank, whose chief executive is now Al-Hassan Andani, for your support for this event. I would also like to thank very much GTV, City FM and City Television, City TV that is, and Asasi Radio for carrying this live for us. And we look forward to seeing you again at our next lecture, which will be by the Under-Secretary General, is that correct? Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations at a date to be announced. And we look forward to seeing all of you. Thank you once again for coming, and thank you, Prof. Wole Soyinka, for enlightening us as you always have done tonight. Thank you. Good night.